2010 GTOAA convention in Wichita, Kansas. We thank you for all your beautiful cars, and sometimes we have to just set ourselves aside for a little while and polish and pack and race and rush, and then we get here and we just know it's been worth it. So we thank you, and we'd like to introduce to you a dignitary from Pontiac, and we'll just let him take it from there. But yeah, on behalf of the Greater Wichita GTO Club, welcome.
Thanks, Robin. Well, I hope you all are having a good time. We're having a good time, and it's going to get even better with a drag race tomorrow and then open to the public on Sunday. So we're looking forward to seeing a lot of Pontiac fans, even though, as the title of Jim's presentation goes, is Who Killed Pontiac? Our famed moniker is no longer here with us, but the spirit lives on in all of us. And so that's what's so important. And Jim will talk a bit about that as we go forward. What you saw just scrolling through briefly is some of Jim's cars that he has collected that have been of great significance to him over the years. As you all know, if you prick his finger, he bleeds Pontiac engine blue. So you know, he's loved these cars all his life. And at 84, the power and performance that we so love of these cars is a little intimidating for Jim. So he'd like some of you in the audience to have that opportunity to own some of those cars that he has so loved over the years. And none of them are made of unobtainium, so don't be shy to come up and ask me about any of them over the course of the rest of the convention. But Jim turned 84 last Saturday. So whenever we're always out of this convention, and thankfully he is going strong. You all adrenalize Jim. The reason that he can still do what he does is the love that the hobby has for that car that he so loved, Pontiac, and how you express it to him. So I'd like to thank all of you for that which you give to Jim. And I know that you know, he says humbly all the time, he was just happened to be the, you know, one of those guys that was there at the right place at the right time when John DeLorean and Russ G and Bill Collins hatched this scheme to create the GTO. But he was more than just there. He led some of the most famous promotions to ever hit the automotive industry, not just Pontiac, but the automotive industry. And he continues to be sought after by news outlets and magazines, not just automobile magazines, but financial and news magazines, for his insightful views of what has gone down in the past and what might happen in the future. And since Jim is one of those few men who lived it and is still with us, he was very, very hurt when we all learned that Pontiac went away. But as he has said to many of you for many, many years, for the last 35 years, Pontiac has been, the management team at Pontiac has been killing all of those great things that Bunky Knudsen and John DeLorean and Pete Estes and the engineering staff that was at Pontiac during the 60s created. And that's why we're all here, because they created some great vehicles. And unfortunately, there were very few great vehicles created after that term, but we still love our cars, and we're happy to be out here and travel the country and seeing. We got to go to Australia this year, and if you ever get a chance to go down there, that's some car-loving people down there. So without further ado, let me introduce to you the godfather of the GTO, 84 years young, Mr. Jim Wangers.
I think I should probably sit down after that. What the hell more can you do? What a wonderful introduction. And what a wonderful crowd. I want you to know how much I appreciate how you folks have welcomed me time and time again, year after year, and this is a beautiful example. Unfortunately, my subject today is not all pleasant. In fact, it's terribly unpleasant. I've come to the event here and I see old friends. I'm shaking hands with the folks from Wichita, from Omaha, from Chicago, from Detroit, from all over the country, but there's one very important friend missing. And unfortunately, you all know who that is. It's Pontiac. If anybody had ever told me 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago that I'd outlive Pontiac, I would have said, you're absolutely out of your mind. What an incredible thought. Unfortunately, you don't need me to tell you that it happened. And I just feel that folks like yourselves, with the tremendous dedication, time, money, affection, all of the things that you contribute and that you participate with, and that you give up just to enjoy these great cars. And in many ways, you deserve to know what happened and why. And more importantly, who. Because it took an awful lot to destroy something that was going awfully well. You know, it's kind of interesting. I'm impressed daily when I read about what's going on our Gulf Coast. When I hear how everybody, from the president right on down, all the members of the press, everybody was beating up on British Petroleum. What a horrendous crime they've done. How many people they have caused to be unemployed, had to change their style of living, had to move out. Well, I compare that rather unfavorably to what happened to my beloved state of Michigan. And how the U.S. auto industry, driven by men who were paid astronomical salaries to make decisions about how to keep that successful, how to keep that running, how to make the tremendous amount of money that they made as they were building that, and how they couldn't do it. And don't blame the imports who came in here and stole this market away from us. That didn't happen. That was a reaction. That's what happened when everybody else got fed up, got tired. I blame the U.S. auto industry every bit as much as you can blame British Petroleum for the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been affected by the failure of the U.S. auto industry to manage itself, to perpetuate itself. And there is no better example than that, what happened at Pontiac. And one in which we are also devoutly dedicated to, and who we really feel a responsibility. This is an emotional thing for me. I'm pissed. And you should be too. There's no reason for what happened, except that I really, in many ways, I've been trying to tell everybody this for the last 35 years. It didn't just happen. All right, let's continue, and instead of beating up on them all together, let's talk a little bit about what Pontiac really was. Before I get into the hard-nosed stuff I'm going to talk about, and I'm not being facetious here, I think it's important that you all understand I'm not going to be kind. And I'm not worried about anybody coming after me, because I'm not going to talk about what guy was running around with somebody else's wife, or what guy was caught with a chorus girl in the bedroom in a hotel. I'm talking about what they didn't do on their job. Documented evidence of highly paid executives who did not do what had to be done because they didn't understand it. Because understanding Pontiac is not an easy task. Because Pontiac was, in fact, an emotion. What really was Pontiac? Well, let's trace it quickly. We all know Pontiac was born in 1926, in the middle of the great period when everything was going fine, the economy was in wonderful situation. The stock market was going crazy. General Motors management told their divisions, every one of them, that they wanted them to bring out a companion car to the makes they were building. Chevrolet, of course, had a truck. Oakland was the father of Pontiac. Oakland brought out a second car called Pontiac. Oldsmobile brought out a car called the Viking. Buick brought out a car called the Marquette. And of course, we all know that Cadillac brought out a wonderful companion car called LaSalle. Well, that all happened in the 20s. Unfortunately, by the 30s, the whole thing had turned around. And by that time, Alfred P. Sloan, had become the chairman of the board of General Motors. As I showed you here, these were the cars that he asked each one of the divisions to bring in. Unfortunately, many of them had to go away. And in the case of Oakland, the Pontiac was more successful than the Oakland. And so they dropped Oakland and continued to participate in the market with a car called Pontiac. And they did indeed make it into a very nice car. But unfortunately, a very nice car in many ways was a yawn. If you couldn't find what you wanted in a Chevrolet, and you couldn't really reach for it in an Oldsmobile or a Buick, then there was the Pontiac. But that wasn't enough. There weren't enough people who took time to look into the middle and figure out a reason why they should buy a Pontiac. Just because it was a nice car? No, that wouldn't carry. Then, of course, came World War II. When everybody quit building cars, the industry got completely out of the car business, went to work building Detroit into the arsenal of democracy. Pontiac, of course, was a big contributor. So the problem of selling cars into a competitive market was actually postponed for a significant period. After World War II, Pontiac went right back into the business of building nice cars. And as you might expect, once the market caught up with itself, the shortage that had occurred during the wartime period was filled. People were now getting much more selective. It was time for Pontiac to become something. Unfortunately, it did not find its place. This is a 1955 Pontiac with an all-new body, introduced an all-new V8 engine, everything in the world going for it product-wise, and it was a flop. And when it came out, it also followed an all-new 1955 Chevrolet. Chevrolet introduced that little small block. I talk about it as if it were an insignificant thing. The small block was the most colossal V8 engine ever built in the world. And it was a little bit similar to the Pontiac. It shared the stamped rocker arm design for the lightweight valve train. That actually was developed by Pontiac. And the corporation asked Pontiac to share it with Chevrolet. But the ugly hard facts were that the 55 Chevy was a smash. And the marketplace just got the idea that the Pontiac was nothing but a big Chevrolet. And so Pontiac went down even further in the midst of one of the strongest product lineups it ever had. There was the great 287 cubic inch Pontiac Strato Street V8. And everybody looked at it and said, it's nothing but a big Chevy. And that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Consequently, facing the challenge of having to beat Chevrolet and having to beat or outstyle Buick and Oldsmobile, Pontiac needed a major change. They had, if I can borrow an expression, shot their load. New car, new engine, new everything, and it failed. Consequently, they brought in a new management team. I'm still talking very positive because with Mr. Bunky Newts, who was a real car guy and had a great vision of what he wanted to make out of Pontiac, which was something they had never, ever thought about before. Bucky Knudsen was an inveterate racer. He just loved auto racing. He was also what we used to call a GM brat, meaning that he grew up in a GM family. His father actually had been president of General Motors some years earlier. He tells the very, very funny story. He was a racer and he wanted to go racing. He had consulted with his engineering team and he knew what he had. Wasn't there yet, but he knew what the potential was. He created within the engineering team a Super Duty group headed by the famed Malcolm McKellar. You all have heard of the McKellar cams, I'm sure. Well, that came from a guy. He headed up this Super Duty group. And in 1956, when Bucky Knudsen was taking charge of the Pontiac division, he said, I want 100 more horsepower out of this V8 engine in less than 2 years. That was what the charge was to that Super Duty group. We're going racing, and I want 100 more horsepower than we're producing now. Now, Bucky tells a very funny story. He had a couple of really good friends, good racing friends. One of them was a guy named Mickey Thompson. I don't have to tell you any more about him. The other one was a guy named Smokey Unick, very famous NASCAR engineering type car builder. He brought them both in, sat them down one day in his office, and he says, guys, I'm going racing. They both had a kind of a sneer and a smirk on their face, you know. And at the same time, they both said, with what? And he proceeded to tell them about what he had coming. And he says, and you guys are going to show me how to do it. Because we're going to make an engine. We're going to make a car with some serious horsepower. And Pontiac is going to become a serious winner. Because we're going after the young people. Now this was in 1956, 1957. He was talking about the young people. Well, there were a whole bunch of young people coming. And he was at the right place at the right time, because these young people coming were all about 8 or 9 or 10 years old. The so-called baby boomers, and I don't have to tell you folks anything about the baby boomers. You are them, for the most part. Well, we knew they were coming. And so he said, we got to get out there and start beating somebody, so by the time the baby boomers come of age, we're going to be a winner. We're going to be a swinging dude who does know how to beat somebody. Consequently, he was at, as I have said so many times, at the right place at the right time. And that started to show up in 1957. Not because Bunky significantly did it personally, but by now the engine was 347 cubic inches. That's good. And that car showed how good it was down at Daytona Beach at the so-called Century Club performance trials. Then came, of course, the great 59, which was Bunky's first all-new car. And with that came the great wide-track Pontiac. And with it, some wonderful new names, all derived seriously from racing. The Bonneville, Le Mans, the Grand Prix. These were all parts of Pontiac's new personality. Pontiac was, in fact, beating somebody, and they were out there proving it. And as it turned out, one of the greatest ways to talk about racing and show the world that we could, in fact, beat somebody was to refer to it as the wide-track Pontiac. Look at that Pontiac out there. You can see the wheels are further apart. That's why they're winning those races, because they handle better. They're safer. They don't roll. It's easier to get in and out. All kinds of great consumer benefits, all adding up to a really, really good car that performed well on the track. The fact that it had 100 more horsepower didn't hurt either. But it all went together in a particularly great effort, which I have labeled affectionately the wide-track era. And by that time, as the wide-track car began to grow and began to become a real part of this new Pontiac philosophy, so did sales. And by 1961, Pontiac had moved from 7th place to 3rd place in sales, trailing only the very popular Chevrolet and Ford. And that in itself was a tremendous accomplishment. Real success. success. Bunty surrounded himself with some real serious and well-trained and most importantly, car-loving guys. I show you here Pete Estes, who was lured from Oldsmobile to come to Pontiac as the chief engineer. And on the right, you see John DeLorean, who had been lured from Packard to come to Pontiac and join in that engineering team that we're going to build swinging, youthful-oriented, young people's cars. A new performance image was now beginning to take serious control. Well, how do you kill that? That's not easy when you got something going that well and you've already moved up to third place in sales. Well, laughingly, if I may take the leisure or I take the opportunity to say, as I have said myself many times, when asked the question, hey, when did Pontiac really start to go downhill? And I'll answer, as I have said so many times, the day the door hit John DeLorean for the last time. In other words, when John DeLorean left and was promoted to Chevrolet. The first one of the enemies, and I'm going to use those terms because he turned out to be just that, an enemy, was a guy by the name of Jim McDonald, who was given the new job of general manager of Pontiac. Here was a guy coming in and was going to keep this thing rolling. Well, Jim was a wonderful guy. He was as nice a person as you ever met. He was a manufacturing guy. He had come up through both Chevrolet and Pontiac, running the manufacturing operations. He had absolutely no idea what was selling at Pontiac. The first thing that he wanted to do was to get competitive with Chevrolet. And the way we're going to get competitive with Chevrolet is to lower our prices. Well, any fool in the industry knew that if you were going to lower your prices, you had to lower your content. And that was the last thing in the world that a Pontiac needed. Pontiac certainly was not, should not, never would be a low-content Chevrolet. And that's what Mr. McDonald set out to do. I could give you 100 examples, but this is the best one. This was their new statement to replace, yes, replace the GTO. They'd show a commercial where they'd say, if you think the GTO is something special, take a look at our new GT37, which was nothing but a Le Mans or a Tempest Custom with a 400 cubic inch engine and less content, less interior, less sophistication, less money, and a flop. Because the world wasn't looking for low-priced GTOs. Let's talk a minute about this effort which came about under Mr. McDonald. The Pontiac Granville. There's a little story that goes behind that. I'm going to take a minute to tell you. All during the late 60s, Pontiac was so successful in selling cars like the Bonneville. We finally brought out a Bonneville Blower, which was nothing but a Bonneville with a little better interior. We made the 8-lug wheels standard, built them in some nice colors, were really good-looking, nice cars, but they were Bonnevilles. Bonnevilles with leather, we used to laughingly call them. Well, we finally ran into some serious resistance. After people had one or two or sometimes even three, they wanted a better Pontiac. They loved their Pontiac, they just wanted something a little better. DeLorean, smart enough to recognize this, went down to the corporation time after time after time, pleading with them to let Pontiac have what we call the C body. In General Motors nomenclature, they had an A and a B and a C, and the C body was the Buick Electra 225, the Olds 98 Regency, and of course, all of the Cadillacs. Pontiac wanted that body because we had the customers. We had people who wanted a Pontiac, but they were tired of a Bonneville, and there wasn't anything any better. And we wanted a car in order to keep them from going to Buick or Olds or Chrysler or even Dodge. Well, they never could get it. Well, after DeLorean left in 1969, the corporation finally relented. Said, okay, here's what we're going to do for you. You've been screaming for a C-body. We're going to give you the C-body upper. That's the greenhouse. Everything that surrounds the windows, from the hood right back to the rear deck. You can put that on your B-body Bonneville, stretch the wheelbase a little bit, and you'll have a kind of a neat new looking car. Well, that was not a bad idea. It was a tremendous substitute. But of course, the worst thing they could ever have done was to try to replace the Bonneville, the name Bonneville. Gazillions of dollars spent on building that as the swingin'est Pontiac you could buy. The nicest, most productive, most deluxe. Now you had a new roof that was going to be on that Bonneville. So you call it the Bonneville Brome or the Bonneville Plus. What you don't do is overpower it with a new name. Well, they didn't understand that. They didn't appreciate the image. So they brought in a car under Mr. McDonald's direction called Granville. And of course people came into the showroom and said, well, you know, what's a Granville? I thought the Bonneville was the best pie. Well, now we've got the new Granville. And they began to look at the two cars, and it wasn't very hard to see that it was pretty much the same car with a little different shape on the roof. But most importantly, they compromised everything. They hurt the Bonneville, and they never got the Granville off the ground. The market wasn't ready for a new Pontiac that looked very much like the Bonneville, but was now called Granville and had a pretty good price penalty. Failure. Not failure in a new car, not failure in a new product, but failure in marketing. Failure to understand and appreciate and respect what the name Bonneville really meant to this great thing called Pontiac. And then that started a whole bunch of new badge engineering efforts coming again from General Motors management. I only pick up a couple here. You all remember, of course, the split grille Chevys, the Astra off the Vega, the Nova, the Ventura, you know, Chevys with split grills. And that was the worst thing that could happen to Pontiac. But in order to get those cars into the marketplace, Pontiac management said, sure, we want them, we'll take them. We don't need any different power, we really don't need much different interior. Give us a little different front end, and we'll build a car called Pontiac. Well, they did, and the public caught on. Let's talk a few minutes about the Grand Am project, also conducted under Mr. McDonald. Mercedes-Benz and BMW had been enjoying some uncommon success in Europe, selling what they called at that time the four-door sports sedan. Now, Europe was recovering much tougher than we were from World War II. The economy was not really good there, so anybody who really wanted to have a nice family car that provided the necessity of a family car and yet had some of the sportiness and the fun of driving overtones, bought a single car. A single car family was quite popular in Europe at that time. And if you wanted a sporty car, you either had to go with a four-door sporty car or you didn't have one. Well, Mercedes and BMW were building a four-door sporty sedan. So Pontiac got the bright idea, let's us beat them to the punch here in the U.S. market. So in 1973, they introduced the Grand Am four-door, which was going to be America's first four-door sporty sedan. Well, that's a hell of a good idea. I can't think of anything any smarter or any better, but when you hear chapter 2, it's going to make you sick. Because in order to make this new car be distinct and different, they needed a new front end. They needed some individual styling that separated it a little bit from the Le Mans. And so all attention went to a new car which was being developed for 1973 with a great old name called GTO. And what was to have been the 73 GTO turned out to be the 73 Grand Am, with that real nice looking kind of a prow front end with the split grille and taking full advantage of the color matched styling. That was the GTO. And they said, okay, we'll do something else for the GTO, but let's put this on the new Grand Am. Well, they did. And the market said, so what? I'm not really a four-door sports sedan buyer. I want a coupe. So when they finally learned that that car was not going to make it, they brought out a Grand Am two-door. But at the same time, look at what happened to the 73 GTO. A real serious afterthought. When people talk to me and said, what's your least favorite GTO? It takes me about 1/10 of a second to say the 73. Because I know the whole story. It was an afterthought. It wasn't even intended to be. And while the 74, in all honesty, was a Nova, no matter what you did to a Chevy Nova, it was still a Nova. But at least it showed some more originality than he did with the 73. So in order to bring in the first of the new sporty sedans, which failed, when they finally recovered a little bit, with the Grand Am two-door, they destroyed our beloved GTO. It started in 73. By that time, another new GM soldier came into Pontiac, a guy by the name of Martin Casario. Another financially trained guy who understood how to run a business, but hadn't got a prayer about what it meant to be a Pontiac. Now, what did he do? I'm going to tell you one of the most serious crimes that ever happened to our beloved nameplate. The SD455 was released by engineering in the fall of 1972, scheduled to be installed in any Firebird, Trans Am, or Formula, in any GTO, and this is the beautiful part about it, a special version of the Grand Prix, starting with the year 1973, which was an all-new Grand Prix. That was released by engineering. At that time, without any question, the most powerful V8 engine available on the U.S. car market. You can give me all the Hemis and all the Mopar stuff and all of the 440s and Chevy's big block. The Super Duty 455 was as good as it could get. Well, Mr. Casario, the new general manager of Pontiac, not a marketing guy, certainly not a Pontiac guy, decided, I'm not sure I want to release that. I think I'm going to hold that up yet because I'm not so sure that it's the popular thing to do. Not with the car market, but with General Motors management. He was more concerned about his own personal career than he was about what would satisfy those starving Pontiac owners who were looking for those wonderful cars of the 60s. Because it was now into the early 70s. And what happened to Pontiac? And this engine sat on his desk from the fall of 1972 until June of 1973, when he was finally convinced to release it. And as you know, it only got released for the Firebird Trans Am and the Firebird Formula. There were a couple of GTOs built. As a matter of fact, they were actually tested by a couple of the magazines. That wonderful Grand Prix package never, ever saw a car. And what an incredible mistake. What an incredible image killer. Because when 1974 came and along came a new looking front end on the Firebirds, it was already too late. And the car, because of the emissions problems, which were getting tougher and tougher and tougher all the time, finally had to be taken off the market in mid-year 1974. Well, that Super Duty Trans Am, the 73-74 era, and the very few Firebird formulas that were built, as you all know, are certainly significant collectors today. And an example of what Pontiac could have been. What a wonderful GTO that would have made. What an incredible Grand Prix model with that Super Duty 455 engine in it. All deprived because a God, a man, charged with the responsibility of running Pontiac, cannot be overlooked. There's a wonderful 74 Super Duty, worth a fortune today. Okay, finally a breath of fresh air showed up at Pontiac as Martin Caserio himself was promoted for doing nothing, that in fact hurting Pontiac significantly. He was promoted up into the corporation and replaced by a guy named Alex Mayer, who came to Pontiac from Chevrolet, where he headed up the Chevrolet engineering department. And that was a responsible job. And Alex was a car lover. Alex liked cars. He was made for Pontiac. Under Alex's tenure, we had such wonderful things as the Can-Am appear on the marketplace. He was the guy who gave us a full support, move ahead and let's get that Smokey and the Bandit program going. You don't need me to tell you this is without any doubt the most popular Pontiac ever built. The 77, 78, 79, black and gold Trans Ams. The Bandit. It couldn't get much better. There was the Grand Prix that was never allowed to happen. But it continued to sell because Pontiac, now known for their wonderful two-door models, Trans Ams, Firebirds, Grand Prix, suddenly the Pontiac image was getting a little bit of resurgence, but only along their coupes. Pontiac is the swinging division that builds good-looking, good-performing coupes. And in 1977 and 78 and 79, led by the Trans Am and the Grand Prix alongside it, Pontiac began to regain a little bit of respect and a little bit of sales momentum. There's a great 79 Trans Am. Along came the next general manager, Mr. Bob Stimp, who, while an engineer, was by no means a marketing guy. Bob decided, when he took over Pontiac, that the Grand Prix is a luxury car and should not have any kind of performance overtones. Well, the first thing he did is to kill the great SJ image. All Grand Prix are going to be LJs. They're going to be luxury coupes. Pontiac doesn't need a hot rod Grand Prix. A guy made that decision, and Pontiac was forced to live by it. And when the downsizing came, what was there? A 301 cubic inch V8 engine, a lovely velour interior, and where do you go from there? What a magnificent way and what an incredible way to destroy an incredibly good car name, Pontiac Grand Prix, and all of the sporty overtones that went. Some of those great 455s and those 428 HOs back in the days when it had the longest hood in the industry, and you bragged about it. Suddenly it was a wimp. It was a nothing. Then came along yet another GM soldier, a guy by the name of Bill Hoagland, who had come up through the finance department. Bill was the controller of the division under Mr. Mayer. And he saw a lot of the good things happening, even though he knew that they were spending some money, and he didn't think that was the way to go. We're going to make money in Pontiac, and we're not going to do those foolish image things. Let me tell you one of the most significant crimes that ever got perpetuated on Pontiac. In 1979, all of the management teams within the corporation were informed that the new A-body cars, meaning the Chevrolet Camaro and the Pontiac Firebird, were going to have to share drivetrains. All right, if you wade through a little bit of the nonsense, that quickly meant that the Z28 Camaro and this magnificent, and I call it magnificent because this was 78 and 79, the Bandit was out there. The Trans Am was the #1 image car in the United States. Corvette had gone to sleep for a couple of years at that time. All of a sudden, in 1979, at the height of that popularity, Mr. Hoagland was informed that the Camaro Z28 and the Pontiac Trans Am, starting in 1982, were going to share the same drivetrain. What could be worse? To try to continue to build this wonderful image, this car called Trans Am. The bandit, the swinging dude, Burt Reynolds himself personified what we wanted Pontiac to be thought of. A hail fellow well man out having fun. I'm enjoying life. I'm driving a Pontiac instead of a lousy Impala. I'm having fun driving and I love it. And the Pontiac's a car for me and the Trans Am's the best way to show it. All of a sudden that was seriously compromised. He learned about it in 1979 and yet in 1982, look what happened. And that car had exactly the same 305 cubic inch V8 with a 4-barrel, as a matter of fact, with 2 4-barrel carburetors as the Chevrolet Z28. And unfortunately, it was downhill from there for this wonderful car called Trans Am. Here, for example, is Road and Track, who in 1982 caught on. General Motors, Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, a contender or a pretender? Well, it was a pretender and it got caught up with. And it did not have to happen. Under Mr. Hoagland, they had this wonderful new concept. We're going to tell the world that Pontiac builds excitement. That's going to be our new advertising line. Well, it was wonderful, except they didn't build any excitement. And a boring bunch of cars that were just sitting out there hanging on, like that Trans Am story I just talked to you about. Now let's talk a few minutes about this project. We got onto the Bonneville thing a little earlier, and I explained and you understood what a great name the Bonneville was, and what it meant to be a Pontiac Bonneville. Well, under this new management team, under Mr. Hoagland, there was a sales manager by the name of George Spalding. George came up with the idea, and this was in 1980, going into 1981. The public doesn't like big cars anymore. And Pontiac's going to lead the way by dropping our big car. And so starting with the year 1982, the Bonneville, this great Pontiac Bonneville that had survived almost everything thrown at it, ended up looking like that. A Cutlass Supreme with a split grille. That was the best, the most exciting, the most luxurious, the most sophisticated car that Pontiac made. What a huge mistake. Look at those in the mid-1960s Bonnevilles. How could you even dream of compromising that image, compromising that momentum, what that meant on the U.S. car market? To have it ultimately evolve to a Cutlass Supreme lookout. Come on. Well, the dealers themselves were so upset about this, they screamed. They practically went on strike. And they convinced, believe it or not, they came to Detroit and convinced Pontiac management that they had better restore a full-size car. And so in 1984, it came back, this time no longer a Bonneville. It was called the Parisienne. And the reason it was called the Parisienne is because it came from Canada, where they had not dropped the full-size car. It was really a Chevy Impala with fender skirts. But it was called Parisienne, and at least it gave the Pontiac dealer a chance to have a full-size car. What kind of unbelievable, foolish management decisions. All this going on over the 35 years that it has taken to destroy this wonderful nameplate. Now let's talk about a guy named Mike Losh, another GM soldier that came in as part of the Pontiac management team. Mike was a guy who had come up completely through the financial department. Didn't have a prayer of what it meant to sell a car on image. didn't understand what it meant to be a Pontiac, to be a young guy's car, to have fun, to have enthusiasm. And under Mike, they decided, by God, if it's going to work for Mercedes-Benz and for BMW and Nissan was getting away with it, let's try the new alphanumeric idea. And so, in that period, in the early 80s, Pontiac, believe it or not, had another Chevy look-alike called the Chevette by Chevrolet. Well, at Pontiac, it was now the T1000. The Sunbird, which really was a competitor in the subcompact era, called the J2000. And the Le Mans now, the new mid-size Le Mans, which had been significantly downsized, which I can't blame them for. That was the time to downsize cars. But now it was called the A6000. And out of the A6000 series came a neat little package called the STE, which was Special Touring Edition. And because Pontiac had some pretty good engineering people, and because they had a budget that could be spent without having to get approval from the top management office, they created this neat little car called this Special Touring Edition. All right, I've already crossed it out. But what happened was that Pontiac only had a 2.8-liter V6 engine. And at the same time, Oldsmobile with that Cutlass Sierra and Buick with a car called Skylark were putting a 3.8-liter V6 engine. So you could go down to your Olds dealer and buy a dumb Olds Cutlass Sierra or a Buick dealer with a dumb Buick Skylark, and you had better performance than you got out of this expensive Pontiac STE. Did Pontiac go downtown as they would have under John DeLorean? Pound on some desks, stomp on some floors, and say, I gotta have that 3.8-liter V6? Not only no, hell no. And the result was the STE faded away. Then came this magnificent project called Fiero. I'm so upset and so angry about that, I went through it too fast. The Fiero was an incredibly great idea that was so completely mismanaged by Pontiac that it went the way it was destined to go, which was flop. Now when Pontiac first came out with that nice-looking two-passenger, four-cylinder car, it was exactly what the market was looking for. Here was a new car with some serious new technology. Here was a car with a four-cylinder engine that got reasonable economy. Perfect car for a young gal who had just graduated, was taking her first job, needed her personal mobility, wanted something that was good looking, reasonably priced. Do you know that when that Fiero first hit the market in 1984, that they did not even offer power steering? Yet they put these great big wide oval tires on it so it had a real good looking wide track look. Can you imagine what it was like for a young gal trying to park that son of a bitch? No power steering. That's the kind of stuff they did that didn't make sense. Instead, they wanted to go racing. We're going to make this into a real serious race car. They introduced the Super Duty program with a lot of high-performance equipment off the floor. And they couldn't wait to get the V6 in there. That wasn't what Pontiac needed. They already had one V8 sporty car. It was called Firebird. And by this time, they were having a little trouble selling that in the mid-'80s after it lost its personality. So along comes this wonderful car, and look what they finally got it to look like. Beautiful. But it wasn't what Pontiac needed. And unfortunately, it died, only to be replaced by the Mazda Miata, the Honda CRX, and a whole bunch of other neat little, good-looking, personal, modestly powered, purposely for young people who were just getting started. They wanted a good-looking, fun-driving, nicely packaged little car. Fiero was there in 1984. But the the Pontiac marketing people never understood, never appreciated how far ahead of the market they were, and consequently it died. But it was replaced. I don't have to say anything. I know you're going to sit there and bust out. This was the Daewoo built Le Mans Aero Coupe. Well, I have no problem with the car, especially when some of the Pontiacs did some things to it and helped it. But it was a joke. And in itself, that's not so serious, except that what went with it, what died, right alongside of it was this marvelous name, Le Mans. After gazillions of dollars had been spent building Le Mans into meaning something for Pontiac, a sporty, fun, modestly powered, good-looking, nice mid-sized sedan coupe. All of a sudden they made a laugh out of it, and it died, and it has never been seen again. Now this stuff doesn't just happen. That's what I'm trying to tell you. These are crimes. These are crimes that are committed by white-collar people charged with serious responsibility of conducting a business. And what I'm sitting here telling you 3 and 4 and 5 times later, you're laughing at it because it's that funny. But it wasn't funny, it was tragic. Then came a guy named John Middlebrook who inherited the division, and we all jumped up and down. Because John Middlebrook first joined Pontiac, if you can believe, way back in the 1960s. He was trained under the John DeLorean era. Here was a guy that knew what the great wide track era was like. Here was a guy that knew what it meant to have a fun, sporty, swinging, youthful-oriented car called GTO, for example. What did John do when he took charge of Pontiac? Nothing. Because John was concerned as much as anybody about his own personal career. And the way to survive in General Motors at this time was not get in trouble. And the way you don't get in trouble is don't do anything. And unfortunately, that's what happened. Under John, for example, came the first 4-door Grand Prix. Awful looking car. Now, you had just gone out and bought one of these, gorgeous, good-looking 2-door Grand Prix. That happens to be the special edition package built by McLaren with a turbocharged V6 in it. A pretty good running car, and a pretty good example of what a Grand Prix used to be like. Imagine what it was like when you pulled up at a stoplight and somebody pulled up with one of those 4-doors that they had just picked up at the Hertz rental stop. You looked at it and said, what? That's a Grand Prix? Another great image compromise. They finally got it right in 1989 when it was announced that Pontiac had obtained the pace car program in 1989. They were looking around for a car to pace that race. It turned out they didn't really have enough power in almost anything they built. So Buick contacted them and said, you know, we happen to have a whole bunch of these turbocharged V6s that we've been building for our Grand Nationals. Got a whole bunch left. How would you like to buy some and create a real special car for that pace car promotion? What a genius of an idea. And so it happened. Not because it was a smart marketing idea, because they had to do it in order to have a car fast enough to pace that race. So after that successful effort, Buick came back and says, you know, we got a whole bunch more. Why don't you buy some more and you can continue with a special model? Pontiac management, under John Middlebrook, said, nah, we're not building any more Pontiacs with Chevys or Buick engines in them. We don't want any more of that special stuff. And yet this was perhaps the most exciting car that Pontiac built during the entire decade of the 80s. The Turbo Trans Am in 1989. When it came time for Mr. Middlebrook to move out, Pontiac inherited yet another GM soldier, Mr. Roy Roberts. Now, Roy Roberts had been the general manager of the GMC truck. He was the first minority to ever achieve that level within General Motors. And unfortunately, Mr. Roberts was much more interested in promoting the fact that a minority had reached that level, a vice president and an executive general manager of a division. And so he spent more time promoting the fact that he had achieved this and what a wonderful accomplishment this was. And how great it was that General Motors was now recognizing minorities. And he unfortunately didn't pay any real attention to the responsibility of running that job. And under Mr. Roberts came the second generation of that new Grand Prix, which I'm showing you here. In 1997, Pontiac introduced a new Grand Prix where the 4-door and the 2-door shared the exact same body architecture. But along with that, they also introduced a new supercharged V6 engine. There is the supercharger. This was the first production supercharger that had ever been put on a car in production that sold for less than $30,000. And what an incredible performance this car was. They called it the GTP. And it was capable. At the time it was introduced, it was the fastest accelerating from 0 to 60, 4-door sedan selling for less than $30,000 in the world. No BMW, no Mercedes, no Audi could run with that car that sold for less than $30,000. Who knows that? Nobody. Because Pontiac didn't see fit to pick that up as an advertising fee. And while the owners recognized what a swinging car this is, and the most significant thing, it attracted a whole bunch of new buyers into Pontiac showrooms that hadn't been anywhere near a Pontiac. What we call, kind of laughingly and kind of lovingly, the computer nerds. Because this was the first car that you could buy, get a laptop, go out to your local drag strip and tune it. Take a couple of 3-4 runs, make some adjustments, make a couple of 3-4 more runs, and what a ball! And what a winner you created just by punching the right buttons at the right time. This was, without any question, had there been any serious imagination of Pontiac management, another GTO. The market was screaming at it, please, please, do it, do more. And young people, people who were in the computer generation were the ones that appreciated it the most. What happened? Nothing. They never got any more than about 14% of the total Grand Prix production out of a car that was just magnificent and ready to, in fact, reintroduce Pontiac on the level that it needed. The computer generation, the 30-year-olds were now ready to seriously look at a Pontiac. Well, unfortunately, then came the wonderful LS engine, the great new V8 General Motors had developed. That, of course, literally, in effect, reinvented the Trans Am. There was a little bit of a shake there, a little bit of surge in sales in the mid to late 90s. But along with that came another new general manager for Pontiac. We called her Miss Pontiac. And Miss was not M-I-S, it was M-I-S-S. Because when, as sweet a heart as she was, and as pretty as she was, and as nice a lady as she was, did not understand. More so than most of the guys I've already been through. The last thing she understood is how to build an exciting, fun-filled car. And of course, while she was in charge, I don't even have to say another word. When people come to me and say, how in the hell did that happen? How could anybody have come out with that package? You know what my answer used to be? I was kind of a smart ass. But I'd say, you know what? Don't blame the guy who styled it. Blame the guy who approved it. that was Liz Myers and her team. And unfortunately, she was still running Pontiac when General Motors finally found a guy that maybe understood things. All of us, I'm sure, recognize Bob Lutz, who has been very much in the news. And it was Bob Lutz himself. I will take a little bit of credit for it because I knew Bob very well. It was Bob who got the Holden folks in Australia and the Pontiac folks in Detroit to sit down at a meeting and create a new car called the GTO. That started in 2002, and it reached the marketplace in 2004. Coming out of this car, this was a 1990 Holden Commodore GTSR that had the 5.7-liter high-performance engine package that was the heart of the new GTO. Unfortunately, the new GTO, I just went through it, I'm sorry. The new GTO came out, and while it was a magnificent car, it was a little dated in style, and particularly dated when you looked at it next to this, which was that nice Grand Prix GTP that had been out. And unfortunately, the GTO did everything that it was meant to do. It beat somebody. And yet Pontiac could not make that a success. Primarily because they themselves, and I show you a picture of the guy who was absolutely the most responsible. Miss Roberts hired a guy named Bob Kraut, a Madison Avenue advertising executive who didn't even really know how to drive a stick shift car. I'm not criticizing him, I'm stating fact. But he took over the responsibility of promoting the new GTO. You talk about the wrong guy at the wrong place at the wrong time. And what did they do with the GTO? First and probably the dumbest. I'll go on record as saying the absolute dumbest thing they did was change that emblem. That magnificent silver and black and red GTO emblem, which while it hadn't been on a car in how many years, yet everybody recognized it the minute they saw it. That's the symbol, that's the emblem, that's the great goat. All you had to do was take that 6.5 and change it to 5.7. All in all, we got a new car, we got to come up with a new emblem. And they did. And that did a whole lot of damage. Because again, we had to return to what the GTO thing means and what's that emblem. And I don't know that I remember the car, and I like to drive one. I could go on. The GTO was born on a drag strip. I don't have to show you any more than those kinds of pictures. So what did they do with it? They went drifting. That's where you stand around and watch the other guy wear out his tires. A big nothing. Sure, it has some attraction for people that like to see cars doing speeds, but it wasn't a GTO. And even worse, it wasn't a Pontiac. So then they went sports car racing. They got into the American Le Mans series, which had a big activity on Saturday afternoon television. And I'm here to tell you that the same 7 people that were watching it back in '04 are still watching. And nobody that loved GTOs cared about sports car racing. The GTO was born on a drag strip. And they meticulously went out of their way to keep the GTO out from under. We are not interested, and I'm going to tell you this happened. We're not interested in talking to those people with, I'm going to insult you, with the dirty fingernails and wearing leather jackets who spend all their money on their old car and haven't got enough money to buy a new car. In fact, we aren't even going to call this an M car. And I said, I got to tell you that you're ahead of me. I don't know what you mean by an M car. Which they promptly and proudly said, we mean a muscle car. We're not going to call this a muscle car. All I could do was just shake my head and walk away. We're going drifting. Well, when they finally got it right in '06, put some hood scoops where they should have been, well, they did that in '05, and they got the exhaust in the right place, and they made a great car even greater. They made a fast car even faster. But by that time, it was over. And they had taken this incredible name, and if I may use this awful word, they pissed all over it. And it did what you might expect it to do. It expired. Because it would have taken some serious money to update it. And at that time, the corporation was beginning to feel the results of some of these kinds of mistakes. And so the wonderful thing that we know and love called GTO suffered an incredible setback, an incredible image. What a slap in the face. Pontiac brought out this car, as damn good a car as it was, and they couldn't sell it. And one of the things that hurt them as much as anything is they ignored you. They ignored the people who had been loving this car for 25 and 30 years. Because you got dirty fingernails and you wear a leather jacket and you spend all your money on your own cars and you're not looking to buy new cars. We're not going to make this a muscle car. I mean, this was a determined, outspoken marketing direction on the part of the people charged with the responsibility of salvaging that wonderful car called Pontiac. And as a result, they finally did it.